Hello, good evening, good day to everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Ask Abhijit show. I hope you're all doing very well. And let me see who all is there today with us. I can see Akanksha, Dungar Singh Johan, Vatsal, Abhinash, Avantika, H8X, Praful, Manish, Vijay, Bhushan, Anurag, Anup, Ideas Hub, Animish, Srihari, Arjun, Abhishek, Kunal, Great Sir is back, Avinash, Lage Raho Online, Om Naik, GK, Bluebird, Asmenor, Harbinger, Varun Sharma, Vatsal, Avantika, Bibek, and lots of other people. Good evening, good day to all of you. I hope you're doing well. And before we begin, please let me know if there is any issue with the image quality. We had a couple of live streams in which the image wasn't very good, so that was unfortunate. I hope that doesn't happen again. So if there is any problem, please let me know. I will keep an eye on the chat messages. So just let me know if the image is fine or if there is any problem with the image. All right. So I think there are no issues. That's what people are saying. No problem. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Great. So with that, let's get into the questions. I have taken a bunch of questions and let's see how many I can answer today. Question one is from Yuvraj Singh. A 5,000-year-old jewelry factory has been found in Rakhigarhi. What's my reaction to this? My reaction is, yay, great, fantastic. We found a jewelry factory. The thing is this, Rakhigarhi is the most likely the largest known uh, Saraswati Sindhu civilization era site, archaeological site that we know of. And I think we have excavated or explored only like 2 or 3% of it. So the majority of this site is still underground and we still don't know much about it. So as we explore and excavate this site further, we will find more such interesting artifacts emerging from it. So we discovered a jewelry factory. There are so many other sites. There are thousands of unexplored, unexcavated archaeological sites along in this entire region. So as we explore and excavate more of them, we'll find lots of other interesting things, jewelry factories, and I don't know. We will be able to uncover the lifestyle of our ancestors. What sort of lives did they live, and so on. Right now, we know very little about them. So this jewelry factory, they found I think gold ornaments and the entire tools for making these various ornaments and things. That's what I heard. I haven't read the news in detail, but it's not surprising, and I'm very happy to see this. So I hope the excavation, the archaeological work goes on, it carries on, and we explore many more sites apart from Rakhigarhi. So it needs to go on, and it's a very good and welcome development. Samarth says, why did India ban wheat exports? Is it because of the heat wave or the cyclones that we witnessed before? About a week ago, the government said we were ready to feed the world. So, what's happening? Is it a loss for us? G7 countries have started to criticize us for banning the wheat exports. Why do they have a problem on about this when they should understand that India has to take care of its own people first? Okay, let's first go into why this was done. So, it has nothing to do with cyclones, as far as I understand. Heat wave, yes, there's been a heat wave in recent days and weeks in northern India and in other parts of India as well. So that has affected the wheat crops, and so that's one factor. The larger factor is that the past 2.5 years, ever since 2020, we went through this terrible, unfortunate pandemic in which the entire country was under lockdown for a long period of time on various occasions. And because of that, the government of India was forced to dip into its food grains reserves. And I think it dispersed free food grains, including wheat, to about 800 million people because people were jobless, people were not working anymore. And that's how the nation was able to tide over this terrible crisis. So the food grain reserves have gone down, and because of this situation in Ukraine, Ukraine is one of the major wheat exporters in the world. Now, the Ukrainian wheat exports are not happening because of the war which is going on there. The ports are blockaded and so on, and therefore, Wheat prices and other food grain prices are rising. Inflation is rising worldwide. India is also dealing with somewhat increasing inflation. And if we keep on exporting our food grains, then the prices will rise even further. I think the prices have risen to record levels when it comes to wheat. So to prevent this from happening, the government of India has temporarily, this is a temporary ban. This is a temporary ban. We have temporarily banned the export of wheat. So this is not a complete blanket ban. Wheat exports will be still allowed on a case by case basis. There will be some nations that have desperate shortages of wheat and all that. So, in case there are situations like that in certain places, then we will allow exports of wheat on a humanitarian basis to such countries where there is a crisis situation. So, that is something we're going to do, but we are not going to allow the unabated full scale export of wheat. I think India is I think the second largest producer of wheat in the world and the sixth or seventh largest exporter of wheat. So right now, India has to look out for its own people first. India has to ensure that the inflation doesn't rise too much. India has to ensure that the wheat prices and food grain prices don't rise too high, because that's going to impose lots of hardships on people, on the population of India. We don't want that to happen. So temporarily, we have banned the export of wheat. Eventually, in the future, when things are better, as judged by the government of India, we may allow the export of wheat to resume. Right now, it is going to be allowed on a case by case basis, only when in cases where certain countries have genuine crisis kind of situation. So that is the reason why India has temporarily banned the wheat exports. Now, you are right. Several G7 countries are criticizing India for banning wheat exports. India has a responsibility to the G7 or whatever. India owes nobody anything. India has a responsibility to its own citizens. India's interest comes first. The national interest comes first, as it has always been across the world. When the coronavirus crisis was going on, the Americans stopped exporting the vaccine raw materials to India. They said America comes first. That's what the Biden administration did. They stopped exporting vaccine raw materials to India because they said that America must come first. So, hey, that's what's happening. Enjoy it. India's national interest will come first. The people of India will always come first. Everything else comes later. That's how it goes, and that's how the world has always rolled, and that's how we are doing. That's what we are doing. We are putting our own interest first. Uh, Yesterday, I released this video about the Jaishankar doctrine. One of the tenets of the Jaishankar doctrine is that our interests come first. Your interests come later. We are going to engage with the world on the basis of shared interests and mutual respect. So when people are criticizing India, why there is no respect? So if you don't want to respect us, you don't expect anything from us. That's how it goes. So that's just how it's going to be. People can criticize, people can crib, people can cry and moan. They can keep doing it. It doesn't matter. India will ensure that its own national interest is first, and that's how it's going to go. So that's why India has banned wheat exports for now. Yash says recently the government of India has ordered VPN service providers to keep logs for 5 years. Is this decision good or bad? Will this affect a normal VPN user who doesn't use VPN for illegal activities? It will affect nobody who doesn't indulge in any illegal activity. Nothing at all. Nothing will change for you. Your life will go on just as it has always go on. Nothing will change for you. At the back end, whatever happens, you were never aware of it anyway. Now you've heard something, makes no difference to your daily life. And how do you know that these VPN providers were not already logging everything and keeping records or logs for whatever years? All of these companies, they share data with the government. Have you ever heard of Prism? I think more than a decade ago, this Prism mass surveillance program came to light when Edward Snowden defected from the US to Russia, and he revealed to the world how the Americans are collecting data of all kinds from people in other countries from all across the world, because they have this monopoly on social media, on the internet, on all that. And that's why they're able to collect metadata, granular data. They know exactly what you think, they know where you've been, they know what sites you visit, good sites, bad sites, whatever. They know exactly what's going on in your life. They may even understand you better than you understand yourself. And that was 10, 12 years ago. And just imagine how it is today. So all of your data is already being logged, but it's being logged by not your government, but by foreign governments, right? So now the government of India has instituted this new policy in which VPN service providers will keep logs and share them with the government on demand. Well, that's good. See, this concept of privacy, it's an illusion. It's a myth. There is no such thing as privacy online. You have a track, you have a record. Everything you have done online is essentially logged somewhere. There is no such thing like privacy. The West likes to talk about privacy and all that, but it is the worst breaker of privacy in the world. So the thing, so what's a VPN? Yeah, let's talk about what a VPN is. VPN is virtual private network. Essentially, it allows you, it if you buy a VPN service, it means that your service provider, VPN provider, will it will allow you to hide your IP address and location whenever you are browsing the internet, or going to any website. So they will not, the website, if it is using cookies or whatever place you're visiting, your tracks will be kind of covered, your actual IP address will be masked, and you will have better data encryption. So, well, let's say you have a VPN, you have bought a VPN service, it's installed on your phone, and you are in a public location, you're using public Wi-Fi, and you want to do a bank transaction. So if your location is exposed, if your IP address is exposed, then there's a higher chance of your bank account getting hacked. So if you use a VPN, that provides you extra layers of security. So that is still going to be there. The only thing is that VPN is no longer going to be anonymous or private. It actually no longer was. There is this famous email provider called Proton Mail. Their USP, unique service, unique service proposition, unique selling proposition, USP, was that it was completely private, and they do not keep any records of what you do. And yet eventually it was revealed that they were keeping track and keeping records of what people were doing. So their entire USP was a lie. So that's how it always has been. There is no such thing as privacy online. So you just need to deal with it and get used to it. And the reason why the government of India is implementing this policy is to crack down on cyber fraud and cyber terrorism and actual terrorism. So it's possible that certain terrorist elements may use VPN services to mask their footprint online and communicate securely with other terrorists in other parts of the, well, of the surface of the planet. So if these logs are kept, then the government of India will be able to crack down upon them, will be able to track them and apprehend them, and maybe even prevent crimes and terrorism. It will also ensure that the incidence of cybercrime, bank fraud, scams, etc., all of that comes down. So actually, it's a very good thing. The government of India is doing this in the pursuit of the national interest, and I think we should all support that. So please understand that there is no such thing as privacy online. You may think what you're doing is private, someone knows about it, or some machine, some algorithm knows about it, and it categorizes and classifies you according to your behavior online. So be aware of that, please. Okay, Rakshit says, in the US, we see black people demanding rights and equality and want to acknowledge the atrocities by European settlers. But why don't we see Native Americans doing the same? This is a very good question. So let us understand that uh, the white settlers, the European settlers, did perpetrated untold, incredible atrocities on two ethnicities: the black people and the natives. The Native Americans, are the true owners of the land. The entire continent of North America actually belongs to the Native Americans. It has been theirs for thousands of years. The white Europeans, the settlers, they came in the last 500 or so years only. They usurped the land, they stole the land, and carried out a horrific genocide of the natives. And also, what they did was they enslaved the black people whom they imported from Africa like goods. So this, the entire success of North America, two nations, America, USA, and Canada, is built upon, it is built upon the genocide of the Native Americans and the enslavement of the African Americans. So the black people also have been subjected to horrific atrocities. There is absolutely no denying that. And today I'm glad to see that uh, this is being recognized today, and black lives do matter now. I mean, if you even look at the track record of the US in the last 50 years, it's been horrible. If you are a black person, then you have a much higher probability of being shot for no reason by the cops. This is a fact. So these days, Black Lives Matter has become a thing, and black people are being more represented in the media, in the TV, uh, in overall social life and all that, which is good. But to some extent, it's all pretense, because they, even now, the black people, the African Americans, they don't have their own political party which looks out for their interests. Why isn't there a political party that looks out for the interests of the African American people? It's not there. Everything is force fitted into two parties, the Republicans or the Democrats. And these days the Democrats claim that they represent all the minority rights and all that, which is very nice to know. And yet, like you point out, nothing is being done to acknowledge the genocide of the Native Americans. The Native Americans are still marginalized. They are still treated like second class citizens. There is still this horrific epidemic of missing women. When a Native American woman goes missing or a girl goes missing, nothing is done about it. Typically, the cops don't even take any action, and they're still forced to live on these reservations, segregated ghettos. So that's the kind of treatment that is still meted out to the Native Americans, and they are still marginalized in the 21st century. So what's truly happening is that the political class of the US is using the issue of black rights and black atrocities for political gains. That's what it is doing. So it is good that the plight of the black people, of the African American people, is now being highlighted. It is a very good thing. But why is the same not happening for the Native Americans? They are still marginalized. So that is the hypocrisy of the West. They don't. It is still a racist society. It is still a highly unequal society. It is still a society in which certain sections of the society are marginalized. They are still demonized in some ways. Stay, don't get off reservation. That's what Hillary Clinton said once during the 2016 presidential campaign. Don't get off the reservation. That is a racist phrase. So the US and the West is still a very racist place. You can see that happening in real time in Eastern Europe. All of that came out in the open when the war began in Ukraine. You could see how the amount of racism that African students and Indian students had to face. So that is not just characteristic of Eastern Europe. It's spread all across the West. These attitudes, they were kept below the surface for a very long time, but the attitudes were always there. The undercurrent of racism has always been there in the Western world. So you see that in this case, the Native Americans are still completely marginalized. They're still second class citizens, and no one cares. That's how it is. So that is the hypocrisy of these so-called progressive liberal types. They are progressive and liberal only when it comes to certain sections of the society, not to all. They don't treat everyone equally. That is the textbook definition of racism and inequality. Okay, Omkar says, who are the original inhabitants of Australia and New Zealand? What was their culture like? Excellent question. Let's take a look at the map, because, as you know, I am a very big fan of the map. So let's go there. So as you can see, this is India, right? You can see where India is. If you go south and east from India, you reach Australia. And further east from Australia, you have New Zealand, which is essentially two big islands and a few smaller ones. And Australia includes the big landmass, the continent of Australia, and Tasmania, which is an island to the south of Victoria. So that is Australia and that is New Zealand. The original inhabitants. Let's take Australia first. The original inhabitants of Australia are the Australian Aboriginal people, the native Australians. And they have inhabited this continent for about, at least I would say, 60,000 years. You can look up the exact amount of years, the exact dating online, but roughly about 60,000 years at least they have lived on the continent of Australia. So, so the native Australians, the Aboriginal Australians, are the original inhabitants and the true uh, owners of the continent of Australia. The white colonization, the European colonization of Australia, began just about 2.5 centuries before today, approximately about 2.5 centuries before today. Before that, there were no white people, no Europeans in Australia. And today, as you can all see, the native Australians, the Australian Aborigines, have been completely marginalized. Their land, the best parts of Australia, have been stolen from them. They are segregated, more or less. As you can see, that the nice parts of Australia, the coastal parts, essentially the eastern and southern coast of Australia, which is the uh, parts of Australia with good climate and greenery, etc., they have all been taken over by the colonizers, by the colonialists, by the settlers. And the arid, inhospitable terrain of Australia is where you can still see some native Australians living. Places like Alice Springs, for instance, where you have significant native Australian presence, and various other places, right? Cairns, Darwin, and various other places. So they were the Australian Aborigines are the original inhabitants of Australia. About 5,000 years before today, you will see that there was an introgression of Indian genetics into the native Australian population. So today, the native Australians, the Australian Aboriginal people, have about between 5 to 10% Indian ancestry. It's because of a voyage made by ancient Indians about 5,000 years before today to Australia, and they clearly settled down over there and intermingled and intermarried with the natives. And that also introduced the Australian wild dog, the dingo, into Australia, which is essentially the nothing but the Indian dog species. So that is about Australia. When it comes to New Zealand, New Zealand is believed to have been uninhabited, free of human settlement, until about 8 or 900 years before today. So about 8 or 900 years before today, the Polynesian peoples called the Maoris settled down in New Zealand. So the true inhabitants, the true owners of New Zealand, are the Maori people. And then you had the same thing as in Australia. The European colonialists came to New Zealand. They had this conflict with the Maori people. Now the Maori people are a warlike people. So there was this violent conflict with the Europeans, but eventually the Maoris lost. They were subjugated, and the land was again stolen from them. And today, I think the Maori people constitute between 15 to 17% of the total population of New Zealand. Everybody else is of essentially from the British Islands. White people, European, English speaking people, most of the others. And even among those 15, 16% of the people who are of Maori ethnicity, only about one-fifth of them can actually speak some form of the Maori language. So, of the entire population of New Zealand, only about 3% of the people, 3%, can speak the Maori language. Everybody else speaks English. So, as you can see, the Maori culture has been wiped out. The Maori language is close to extinction. The land has been stolen from the natives, and they are marginalized today. And there is a much higher rate of crime and homelessness and drug addiction and alcohol abuse and all that among the Maori people compared to the white people. And similarly for Australia, the Aboriginal people have a much lower life expectancy and much higher incidence of substance abuse and all kinds of other problems. They are also treated like the way the African Americans are treated in North America. The cops are much more likely to shoot them or to imprison them on no charges, etc. So that's how it is. A very racist society, a very brutal society. The true inhabitants are marginalized. The culture of the native Australians is a very peaceful, gentle culture. It is one with nature. It kind of recognizes nature as the mother, as sacred, as divine, polytheistic culture. So that's how it is. In some ways, there are some parallels with Indian culture. So that is about the original inhabitants of Australia and New Zealand and their culture. Himangi says, how can India take its revenge for all the humiliations it faced from the Turks and the Europeans? The best form of revenge is success. So that's it. India needs to succeed. India needs to rise again. India is not an emerging nation. India is not an emerging economy. It is a re-emerging economy and nation and civilization. So the best form of revenge is for India to rise to its full potential and reclaim its original historical position in the global sphere, essentially as an economic, cultural, civilizational, and military superpower, and as the pioneer, as the nation that is at the forefront of science and technology. It is quite dispiriting to see people disparage science, that science is wrong. Come on, India invented science. So what India needs to do is India needs to rise. India needs to become prosperous, successful, and powerful. That is the best revenge. Then everything will fall into place. So that's what I can say. Okay, two questions from Dungar Singh Chauhan. Any updates on the James Webb Telescope? And can the James Webb Telescope help us understand anything about oumuamua? Okay. The James Webb Space Telescope, in case some of you may not know, is a new space telescope that has been launched. It was launched in December, at the end of December last year, 2021. And it has, after a journey of a month or so, it reached its destination in space at the I think the L3 Lagrange point, which it will orbit, and it's going to peer deep into space. It is an improved, it's a much bigger space telescope compared to the Hubble Space Telescope. The mirror is much larger, and it operates primarily in the infrared domain. And it will essentially function as a time machine. It will peer further back and further far away into space than the Hubble Space Telescope ever could have done. So it's a much more powerful space telescope, and the instruments have all been calibrated, more or less calibrated by now. Initially, the each of the segments, the hexagonal segments of the mirror, was producing a different, distinct image of each star. But now they have all been focused together. The alignment is done, and it is more or less, it has almost reached its operating temperature, which is like very close to absolute zero. So it's almost ready. It's already taking images. The images are coming out very good. So it is almost ready. I think we could start seeing the first science data within a month or two at most. So we are already in the middle of May. I think most likely within the next month or so, we should be able to see the first science data coming in from the James Webb Telescope, space telescope. So that is the status as of now. Very exciting. So can the James Webb Space Telescope help us understand anything about Oumuamua? Not quite. It is not a telescope that is designed to focus on a narrow point in space. So uh, if you want to study Oumuamua with a telescope, you would have to focus on a very narrow point in space, right? So what is Oumuamua? It is what looks like a space rock of some kind, which essentially is now known to have come from outer space. It is not something that was part of the solar system. It came from outside the solar system. It passed through, it went around the sun in a hyperbolic orbit. I'm not sure if it was hyperbolic or parabolic, most likely hyperbolic, and it's now going back out into outer space. It will never come back again, as far as we know. So, and there has been some speculation that it may have been an artificial object, because uh, the amount of light it was reflecting was kind of excessive, and it seemed to change its speed. like acceleration kind of thing, which is not normal for a space rock. So some people have speculated or claimed that it is an artificial object, maybe some kind of probe that came into the solar system. So, so yeah, that's the claim that's been made, and there is no real way right now of studying it because it's so small and it's already so far away. It may be possible to catch up with it if we launch spacecraft this year or maybe the next year. Then maybe one could be able to catch up with it in the next decade or decade and a half, possibly. In that case, we would be able to study it. But the James Webb telescope is not designed to focus on a very narrow point in space. It is designed to focus on large areas of space and collect lots of data and information. So, so I don't expect the James Webb Space Telescope to be used for studying Oumuamua. There will be planetary science done with this telescope. Solar system objects will be investigated because many of our solar system objects, they emit radiation in the infrared wavelengths. So yeah, in that case, we will get some new information, but not in the case of Oumuamua. Bruh says, what is the Bretton Woods system? Let me just take a look at the live chat. Is there any issue with the image? I think it's all fine. All right. So the question is, what is the Bretton Woods system? The Bretton Woods system is the economic system that was created by the victorious powers of the Second European Tribal War, which is better known as World War II. So the victorious powers in the Second World War was actually the victorious power, which is the United States. So the United States created this Bretton Woods system along with its allies, the countries that were on the victorious side, and it is called the Bretton Woods system because there was a conference which took place, a 2 or 3 week conference that took place in the Bretton Woods hotel in the US. So what was done is that as part of the system, as part of the agreement, the US dollar was institutionalized as the global reserve currency. It was pegged to gold. I think $35 an ounce or something like that. Look it up. I'm not sure. Most likely that sort of price. So the US dollar was institutionalized as the proxy for gold, and it was made the default international currency. That's the first thing that's the first pillar of the Bretton Woods system. And also two uh, institutions were created the IMF and the World Bank. So these are two institutions that still exist today. The ostensible aim of these institutions was to provide finances and support to developing countries and countries which were devastated in the Second World War and that sort of thing. The IMF and the World Bank, which still exist today. So the dollar became the default reserve international currency. It was pegged to the price of gold. So this agreement happened in 1944, I think, and it became fully operational in the late 1950s. So, and until the 1970s, the US dollar remained pegged to gold, and then the US President Richard Nixon kind of devalued the price of the dollar and eventually delinked the dollar from gold, from the price of gold. So the dollar became a free floating currency. It was no longer linked to gold, and the US could print as many dollars as they wanted. It actually eventually became the petrodollar. It became tied in a way to the price of oil because transactions are all mostly done nowadays in US dollars. So the Bretton Woods system kind of collapsed in the 1970s, and yet the hegemony it created still exists, the American hegemony. The entire global financial system is more or less predicated on the US dollar. It is based in the US dollar, so which gives the United States enormous leverage globally, economic leverage. It can impose sanctions on any country which cuts the country off from the US dollar, which means the country cannot transact anything with the rest of the world without paying very heavy prices. And the IMF, the World Bank, also, they are instruments of essentially Western or US hegemony. and so on. So the Bretton Woods system, even though it collapsed in the 1970s, it created the American economic hegemony that we still see today. So it all began in 1944 in the end stage of the Second World War. So that, in brief, is about the Bretton Woods system. Samarth says, "What should be India's position on this on South Korea's desire to join the Quad? Let it join the Quad. Let's make it a quintet, no longer the Quad, a quintet. You know what? Let's examine what the Quad is. Let's go to the map and take a look at the Quad countries. Which are the countries that constitute the Quad? You have the United States, you have Australia, you have Japan, and you have India. Four countries constitute the Quad. Now, the US is the global superpower. Australia is a US corporation or a US colony. Japan is under US military occupation since 1945. It is a US vassal state. Only India has an independent foreign policy. So you have India and three nations, which are either the US or extensions of the US. So it is essentially an Indo US collaboration of some kind. That's what the Quad is. Now, the objective of the Quad obviously is to counterbalance China. India obviously will feel threatened by the rise of China. China has, in the historically shown, it's that it is not reliable, that it seeks to break India, that it sees India as a threat. It does not seek India to do well. And China is obviously a very large economy, like five times that of India today in terms of overall GDP, and it has a correspondingly much larger military strength. So obviously, India would want to ally with other nations, ally or partner with other nations in order to counterbalance China. The US is obviously alarmed at the rise of China, so it also wants to use India as a counterweight in Asia to China. And why not go in with the other vassal states like Australia and Japan? Because Australia also feels threatened by China, by the rise of China. The Chinese have infiltrated deep into Australia. Their tentacles are deep into Australian politics, into the Australian economy, and various walks of life. So the Australians are really alarmed about the rise of China. There is this new development. The Solomon Islands have inked a pact with China, which has military dimensions. So you could have Chinese missiles at Australia's doorstep, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. That sort of situation. And obviously, Japan also is alarmed about the rise of China because the Chinese seek to destabilize and eventually, hopefully, possibly destroy Japan. Right. So all of these nations see China as a threat, rightfully so, and that's why these four countries are together in this quadrilateral dialogue. It's called, right. Now, South Korea also has, well, it doesn't have very good relations historically with China. North Korea is a Chinese satellite state. South Korea is a US vassal state. It is under military occupation by the US since the 1950s, permanent US military occupation. So South Korea itself is like an extension of the US, just like Japan and Australia are US vassal states. Similarly, South Korea is also a US vassal state. So whether South Korea officially comes into the Quad or not, it doesn't make much of a difference. It will anyway do whatever the US tells it to do. It is an instrument of the US. So whether it is officially part of the Quad or not, it is anyway on the side of the Quad, in the same boat as the Quad. So as far as India is concerned, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Obviously, there are things like optics and diplomacy and all that. If South Korea joins the Quad, then it looks like the Quad is embarking on an expansion, the way NATO expanded in Europe, and that might be seen by the Chinese as some kind of provocation. So maybe it may not be the best idea for South Korea to join the Quad. Anyway, it makes no difference because South Korea is anyway an extension of the US and as such is in the same boat. And therefore, even if it is not actually officially part of the Quad, its policies will be anyway aligned with those of the Quad. So it really makes no difference in the real world. Okay, Lone Wolf says, Thank you for this video. The pacifist ideology was the reason why many years ago I rejected the Indian part of my ancestry. I am mixed race. My mother is 100% Indian. I had in fact presumed that my mother's ancestors were weaklings and nothing to be proud of. So it's music to my ears to find that my ancestors did in fact have a warrior spirit. I would like to find out more about their warrior culture, who were the greatest Indian warriors, what their stories and deeds. Where can I find this information? What is a good starting point? Unfortunately, I don't speak my ancestors' language and can only read English translations at the present. So, yeah, many people believe that India is a nation of weaklings. That's what we have all been taught. That's the kind of image that has been projected by Indian and Western historians. India's historians are essentially puppets of the West. They have always towed the Western line. There is no new real research coming out of India since the past 70 plus years. So yeah, there is this image of Indians as weaklings. I myself used to dislike reading Indian history because it was so dispiriting and depressing, all full of defeats and all, until I discovered the real Indian history. So the depressing part is just the past 1,000 years, which I call India's millennium of humiliation. Before that, India was the greatest civilization in the world. It is the oldest continuously existing civilization the world has ever known. And India was a military uh, was a country of military excellence. As we know, the Cholas conquered Southeast Asia all the way to the Philippines, right? Maritime conquest. The Guptas conquered reconquered Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia. Lalitaditya Muktapida conquered large parts of Central Asia, even some parts of present day Xinjiang. The Kushans had their empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Aral Sea, and it included the Tarim River Basin part, which is most of today's present day Xinjiang region of China, and so on and so forth. Um, the Yamnaya invaders of Europe, who completely transformed the genetics of Europe, were of Indian origin, and so on and so forth. So, unfortunately, the problem is that you will not find most of these things that I just mentioned, you won't find them in any history textbook. Yeah, our history textbooks want to portray a very weak and pacifist kind of image of India that stems from the ideology of Mohandas Gandhi, who kept on insisting on turning the other cheek and never fight back. So, unfortunately, most textbooks, whether they are written by foreign authors or Indian authors, do not mention any of this in any detail. If you want to learn about the Kushan conquests and the Gupta Empire, etc., even the Chola Empire, one of the good sources is the author R.C. Majumdar, who essentially wrote his books nearly a century ago, and yet so much of the information, at least some of the information, is kind of outdated, and yet they are excellent reference books for those portions of Indian history. And what what I have done is I have researched. I've read research papers, journal articles, etc., from which I got much of my information. But I can't really think of any other textbook or history book apart from the books by R.C. Majumdar that go into any detail about these periods of Indian history. But most of the information is available online in different places. You have to be judicious in judging whether the information you are reading is correct or not, because some of these are just blog posts. Obviously, blog posts are not authoritative. I would say read research papers, research articles from peer reviewed journals, etc. From and if you can, yeah, so that would be a good starting point. And yeah, so that's what I can say. But this entire image of India as a nation of weaklings, as a nation with this ideology of losers, the ideology of Mohandas Gandhi, that is a false image. India was entirely different. India was a nation of saints and scholars and also warriors and also farmers. Everybody was there. Everybody contributed equally. I mean, you can't have a great civilization without equal contributions from all walks of life. And you had that in India. India was the greatest maritime seafaring civilization of all time. And you will not see this being mentioned anywhere. I mean, how did the Cholas conquer all the way to the Philippines? How did the people of Kalinga inculturate Southeast Asia? almost 2000 years before the Cholas, and so on. So there's a lot that is not taught, but it's all nowadays available online. You just need to learn to look for the information in the right places. So all the best to you, sir. Okay, bro, again. Do you think Russia's foreign policy revolves around Mackinder's heartland thesis? Some policy experts believe that a multipolar world which India and Russia seek is an unstable world. What are your thoughts on that? In order for India's plans against the Chinese, Tibet plays a vital role. How do you think, what do you think could be changed where 50% of the Tibetan population is today Han Chinese? Actually, today more than 50% of the population of Tibet is Han Chinese. The Chinese have completely transformed the demographics of Tibet. The Han Chinese, the Chinese speaking people, are now a majority in Tibet. The Tibetans are now a minority in their own land, in their own country. So that's where we are. Anyway, uh, do I think Russia's foreign policy revolves around Mackinder's heartland thesis? Good question. So, what is Mackinder's heartland thesis? So, Mackinder was a I think, British historian, as far as I remember, most likely British. So he proposed this theory or this thesis, which is called the Heartland thesis, which says that the power that controls Eurasia and Africa is going to control the world and rule the world. So, according to his theory, Europe, Asia, and Africa are the heartland of the world island, and the outer islands or outer lands are the North and South America and Australia and the other islands. So, according to Mackinder, the power that controls Eurasia and Africa is going to rule the world. And the heartland, the actual heartland, is north of the Himalayas, all the way up to Siberia, and west of the Volga, I think, and east of the Yangtze. So, this entire region of Eurasia, north of the Himalayas, between Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia, is the actual heartland of the world. And according to Mackinder, the nation or the power that controls the heartland is going to rule the world. And of course, you have Mahan's thesis, which is the rimland thesis, which says that the maritime powers will rule the world. So whichever nation can control the seas, the oceans of the world, is going to control the world. So these are two competing hypotheses. These are still theories. Nobody has actually tested them out. There has never been an instance in the entire history of the world where any power controls the entire heartland of Eurasia. So Russia, obviously, as you know, occupies much of the heartland of Mackinder. So yes, it will obviously consolidate. It will seek to consolidate its power in that region. The Chinese are embarking upon a dual strategy of trying to control the rimland, which is the oceans, the trade routes, and also parts of the heartland via the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. So, yeah, these are two powers that seek to control various parts of the world. And obviously, as we know, the Americans are the dominant power in Western Europe, parts of Northern Europe. They're trying to expand eastwards, and they are also the dominant power in the oceans. But there has never been a time in the entire history of the world that one power has controlled the entire heartland, what Mackinder defined as the heartland. So I don't think Russia's foreign policy revolves around the heartland thesis. Uh, they wish to stop NATO's expansion, and they also wish to, in the long run, counterbalance China in some way. They have to rise again for that. So that is, in short, what Russia's foreign policy is. Long-term foreign policy is likely to be. Some policy experts believe a multipolar world will be unstable. Well, that's just a hypothesis. How do we know it will be unstable? Maybe it will be more stable. Maybe it will be a much more fairer and egalitarian world, a world with less hegemony from one source. So, so yeah, it's very, people can believe anything, but what's the evidence that it's going to be like that? There is no such evidence. Experts have opinions, even non-experts have opinions. You know what they say about opinions, right? Everyone has one. It doesn't make any difference. This belief or opinion is not really based on any actual data. So it's just an opinion. It doesn't really matter. And Tibet plays a vital role. The Han population is over 50% in Tibet. What can India do? India can do nothing right now. Uh, Someday, if we are able to liberate Tibet, then we will think about that when we come to that point in history. Right now, there's no point thinking about that. Imperior says, should states in our country be subordinates of the center, or should they have some autonomy to maintain the so-called federal structure? What is this federal structure, and why is it so important? What's really important is the long-term national interest. So the national interest is what we need to look after, not some idea of India which incorporates a federal structure or whatever else it is. And a nation, a civilization state like India, which is so large, it is a subcontinent sized civilization. A nation of that scale needs to be ruled from the center. It needs a very strong central authority that rules it. Look at the past few thousand years of Indian history and think about the times when India was the most prosperous and the most powerful. Each of these times, India had a very strong central government. That's how it has always been. So, whenever India has done well, it has had a strong central government and no so called federal structure. And of course, there has been self rule at the level of the villages and cities and towns. So there has always been some form of democracy in India, but an Indian hybrid form of democracy. India has had an imperial system and localized democracy, which essentially means that people can decide how they're going to live and how they're going to govern themselves at the local level. So that is what is best suited for India. States, I think, have too much autonomy. Too many states go in directions that are actually inimical to the Indian national interest. I'm not naming any specific state, but we can see examples today of that happening in real time. So I think states have too much power. There is too much so called democracy in India, like the Chinese are fond of saying. So, states, first of all, one should also be open to the idea to have more states. Some states are enormous, 300 million plus population. Some states have a population of 2 million. We should have states that are of approximately similar size. And the smaller a state is going to be, or a smaller an administrative unit is going to be, the better governed it is going to be, because there will be more proximity for each person, for each citizen to the government. So, eventually, some restructuring of India needs to happen. What really matters in the long run is the overall long term national interest, not these little petty disputes between states and more autonomy for states and all that. States have too much autonomy right now. Too many of them go in directions that are not good for the national interest. So this needs to be revisited at the right time. Not yet. Okay, Bidanto Biswas says, would it have been better if Mikhail Gorbachev was the first president of Russia instead of Boris Yeltsin? Although many people blame Gorbachev for the disintegration of the USSR, he had realized the fact that the USSR needed some political and economic changes. If Gorbachev was the first president, would the shock therapy have been less intensive and Russia be in comparatively less turmoil? And could it also have changed the present political scenario? Let's understand what really happened. The Russians consider Gorbachev to be a traitor. They regard him as a Western puppet, as an agent of the US. So he introduced in the 1980s these changes. You said that he realized that USSR needed some political economic changes. Why? These changes destroyed the nation. He instituted perestroika and glasnost, opening up and self-criticism and admission of guilt and whatnot. It made the USSR look weak. It made the government look weak. Every government has shortcomings. Every government has failings. You think the US government did not have any shortcomings and failings at the time? But they never admitted any of the shortcomings. But Gorbachev embarked upon this crusade of self criticism, of perestroika, of glasnost, of revealing what's wrong with the USSR, and of allowing more autonomy and allowing free speech. There is no such thing as free speech, actually. You know that? Anyway, so he did all those things, and the actions that it took in the 1980s, they resulted in the disintegration of the USSR, right? So he destroyed the nation that his predecessors had built. He destroyed essentially the empire his had built. That's what he did. So his job was done. His job was done. He became the darling of the West. He still is the darling of the West. He's still a word of wisdom, a word of reason. He's still critical of the way Russia is run today. So it's quite clear that there is some element of truth in this allegation that he was in some way pro-West, or possibly even an agent of the West. So his job was to destroy the USSR. His job was done, and then he was sidelined, and then a new job had to be done. So out of the USSR came out one big entity, which was Russia. Now, Russia was still extremely powerful with a huge economy and a powerful state machinery and a fully industrialized nation. And the industries were in the hands of the state, of the government. So that's where Boris Yeltsin comes in. Boris Yeltsin played a major role in the so-called disintegration of the USSR, not the so-called, the actual disintegration of the USSR. Uh, he was part of the protests. He climbed a tank and posed in front of the Western media and so on. And eventually, he became the first president of Russia. And what he did during his presidency, apart from drink copious amounts of alcohol, what he did was he destroyed the Russian economy thoroughly. See, it's like this. Russia, the USSR, was a communist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. All property was collectivized. The nation's wealth was collectivized. Its custodian was the Communist Party, but the wealth, the industries, and all property belonged to the people. And the entire GDP, everything the USSR had built up, had been built by the labor of the people. So when Russia became emerged out of the USSR, everything that was present in Russia, the industries, the land, the money, the foreign reserves, everything, it belonged to the people. It was the result of decades of labor done by the people. Now, what this fellow Yeltsin did is that he privatized everything, and he placed Russia's industries in the hands of a few crooked people who are now called the oligarchs, right? And he ensured that he appointed the worst people to run all these industries. And in in a period of just a few years, all of these industries were essentially bankrupted. So the first thing he did was he took all of the money that was the fruit of decades of labor of the Russian people, and he placed all that money in the pockets of a few corrupt people. He stole all the money. All the money was stolen. The people's money was stolen, and it became the property of these corrupt oligarchs. And secondly, the oligarchs proceeded to destroy thoroughly the Russian economy and destroy the industries of Russia. And they parked away enormous amounts of money in the West, right? All these Russian oligarchs have properties in the West, in London, etc. And much of the money is still sitting there. So that was the role that Boris Yeltsin played. He was also essentially an agent of the West. So he was suited for this role of destroying the Russian economy. Gorbachev was more suitable to destroying the USSR. So they both played their role. It's only after Vladimir Putin came to power that he stopped the bleeding and started rebuilding Russia, and that's why the Second Cold War started, and it's now slowly becoming a hot war. So I don't think Gorbachev should have been. I mean, Gorbachev did his job of destroying the USSR, and Yeltsin did his job of destroying Russia. And it's only because of an accident that someone like Putin came to power, and he turned out to be the guy who slowly transformed the fortunes of Russia. So that's what I have to say about this. Okay, Animish says, what can we learn from the strategy Putin used in Chechnya? How was he able to crush the terrorism? Can we do anything of that sort in Kashmir? Okay, let's understand Chechnya. What happened there? First of all, when it comes to Chechnya, the people of Chechnya have an enormous amount of respect for Vladimir Putin. The president, is it, of Chechnya, Kadyrov, Ramzan Kadyrov, the son of Ahmad Kadyrov. So the current president of Chechnya, who is essentially the de facto king of Chechnya, is Ramzan Kadyrov. If you go to his house, if you go to his palace, you will see two enormous portraits in the main room, in the hall. One of these enormous portraits is Ahmad Kadyrov, Ramzan Kadyrov's father. And the second portrait is that of Vladimir Putin. So essentially, Ramzan Kadyrov treats Vladimir Putin on par with his own father, right? And he is completely and utterly loyal to Vladimir Putin. And the Chechens are now completely loyal to Russia. They are now fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia. A significant portion of the Russian military comes from Chechnya, because Chechnya is one place where the birth rate is greater than the death rate. So the population is growing over there. But it was not always the case. There was a time when Chechnya tried to secede from the USSR, from Russia itself. After the disintegration of the USSR, Chechnya was part of Russia. Now, they wanted to become an independent country. They actually declared independence in the 1990s. The Russians tried to reintegrate Chechnya through military means under Boris Yeltsin. The first Chechen war happened in the mid 90s. Look up the dates. I don't memorize dates. It was in the mid 90s, and the Russians lost the first Chechen war. That was a disaster for Russia, military disaster. Then, after Vladimir Putin came to power, the first thing he did, more or less the first thing he did, it was on the top of his list of priorities. He embarked upon the second Chechen war, and he crushed the resistance. The Russian military crushed the resistance, and Chechnya was reintegrated into Russia through brute force. It was like they pulverized, flattened Chechnya. It was brute force, overwhelming force, and it was bloody and it was brutal. So, what Putin did was that he cultivated certain elements of the Chechen so-called freedom struggle, who turned their allegiance and became allies of Russia. One of them was Ahmad Kadyrov, who became the I think he became the president after the war was over. He was assassinated, and then his son became the president, or whatever the title is of the head of the republic. So, what Putin did is that he spoke to these Chechens in a language they understood. There is the language of power, the language of force, brute force. Some see, every culture is different. There is nothing right or wrong about any culture. There is nothing especially good or bad. From a certain perspective, you can see it like that. So, in some cultures, people respect wisdom, knowledge, refinement, civilization. In some cultures, people respect brute force and strength. So, in the case of Chechnya, it's like they respect strength, they respect brute force. And Putin showed that he will be respected. He is worthy of respect. So, the Chechens respect him today. So, that's what he did. He was able to crush the terrorism with an iron fist. He smashed the resistance out of Chechnya. That's what he did. We should not do that in Kashmir. The Kashmiris are our own people. Some elements may be there in currently in Kashmir, which may be pro Pakistan or whatever. That will be taken care of in due time. We should not use the Chechnya model in Kashmir. Well, we have a different way of doing things. And I'm sure we can do it in our own way without resorting to overwhelming force or anything. We should see, the people of Kashmir are our own brothers and sisters. They're the same blood as us. Some of them may be misguided. We will re-guide them, right? So that's what we should do. We should not uh, employ military means or brute force tactics. Okay. Saurabh says, what is the script of the Mittani kingdom? How was this script deciphered, which had Vedic names? What is their native language, and what was the form of Sanskrit found there, Vedic or post Vedic? Hmm. Okay, yeah, that's essentially the gist of the question. So let's go into what the Mittani kingdom or Mittani empire. So let's go to the map once again. I'm sure you all know where India is. This is India. Let's go westwards, inch by inch, inch by inch. This is temporarily the country of Pakistan. Then you have Gandhar, which is now called Afghanistan. You go further west, you come to the land of the Parsha people, the Persians, the Iranians. You go further west, you come to Iraq, Mesopotamia, and further west is Anatolia. So the Mittani kingdom or Mittani empire flourished in this region, present day Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia, about 3,500 years before today, roughly, okay, plus or minus a couple of centuries. And it was in power for about 350 years, 3.5 centuries or so. So that is the Mittani kingdom. Its capital was Vashokhanni, which means in Sanskrit the mine of treasure. So that was the Mittani kingdom or Mittani empire. Now, what was the script that they used? What was the language they spoke? So, first of all, let's talk about the language. The language that the people of this empire or kingdom spoke was the Hurrian language, which is an extinct language. It was, I think, not an Indo-European language. Uh, it belonged to a local language family, which is now no longer extant. So that is the language that the people spoke, the majority of the population. But the aristocracy, the royalty, spoke a different language. They spoke Sanskrit, not Persian. They spoke Sanskrit. And what form of Sanskrit did they speak? They spoke late Vedic Sanskrit, not pre-Vedic or Vedic Sanskrit, but late Vedic Sanskrit. So the Sanskrit language has evolved over the thousands of years. Vedic Sanskrit, the kind of Sanskrit you find in the Rig Veda, is different from the Sanskrit you find in the later Vedas. So the Sanskrit, these people, the royalty, the aristocracy of the Mittani kingdom spoke was late Vedic Sanskrit, and we know because certain words that they used were not found in early Vedic Sanskrit. One of the best examples is the word for night. So the early Vedic word for night time. Today, what is the Sanskrit word for night? It is Ratri, right? That's the word that we can use in any Indian language. Ratri. So that is the word we use today for night time. Ratri. So that was the word that was used in Sanskrit for night time in the late Vedic phase. But in the early Vedic phase, during the Rig Vedic phase, there was a different word. And at that time, the word for night was Nakta. Nakta, N-A-K-T, Nakta. And that is the word from where the English word night comes from. The Latin word nocte comes from. It comes from the Vedic Sanskrit word nakta. But later, a new word came in, which was ratri, which is what we use now. So the Mittani royalty and aristocracy spoke late Vedic Sanskrit, not early Vedic Sanskrit, which means that they were from a time period much later than the time period of the Rig Veda. That clearly shows that, right? So that tells you clearly that the Rig Veda must have been written a long time before 1500 BCE. That's one of the ways of dating approximately the Rig Veda, roughly, rough dating, right? So the native language of the aristocracy and the royalty of the Mittani was late Vedic Sanskrit. They were migrants out of India. They had conquered this land and they were administering and ruling it. The natives spoke the Hurrian language, which was not an Indian or Indo-Iranian language. It was a different, it belonged to a different language family. So how do we know all this? Because we have found inscriptions. There is one very famous inscription. It's an entire horse training manual which can still be used today to train horses. It was written by a horse master whose name was Kekulli, and he wrote this entire training manual in the Hurrian language. But there were certain terms for which there was no word in the Hurrian language, and therefore he had to use Sanskrit terms for that. So that's where we find the first evidence of written Sanskrit. So that's So the script that was used for this in this kingdom was the cuneiform script. uh, I think it was one of the Assyrian variants of the cuneiform script, as far as I know, or was it the Hittite variant? One of those variants of the cuneiform script. So, how was this script deciphered? It took a long time. The first attempts to decipher the cuneiform script happened in the 1700s. In the 18th century, did not make much progress. Then, in the 1800s, in the first half of the century, the 19th century, uh, people started studying the various inscriptions in cuneiform in Naqsh Rostam and the Behistun Bagastan inscription in Persia. And slowly, by comparing it with other inscriptions, etc., and by hypothesizing that it would sound like Sanskrit, they were able to slowly crack the script. So the hypothesis, so these people who were trying to study the script had been to India, and they knew about the presence of Parsi people in India. Persian refugees who had come to India and who were given shelter in India quite magnanimously, I would add. So they knew that there were similarities between Persian and Sanskrit. So they hypothesized that this script would sound like Sanskrit and it would be more or less just like Sanskrit. In using that hypothesis, they were able to slowly crack the script. And then they were able to find certain uh, inscriptions in two or three languages where they could compare the 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 inscriptions and verify whether their translation was correct or not. And they also found some kind of pot or something in Egypt which had an inscription in the cuneiform script and also in Egyptian hieroglyphics, which gave them further clues. So it took a few decades, but the script was eventually cracked, and they discovered that they were right. The ancient Persian language of the Bhagastan inscription, of the Naqsh Rostam inscription, etc., they sounded just like Sanskrit. They discovered that old Persian from the Hakshamanish dynasty time, 3000 years before today, was essentially an upper branch version of Sanskrit, a slightly corrupted version of Sanskrit. So that is the story of this entire matter. Good question, sir. Tushit says when foreign tourists come to India, they go to very crowded and dirty places like whatever in Delhi and whatever in Mumbai. That's why people think India is a very poor country filled with slums. How can we change this perception? Well, the first thing is that slums do exist in India. But you are right. Foreigners, especially from Western countries, they love to visit slums. They do these slum tours in various parts of India, especially in some big cities where you have lots of slums. And one of the attractions for them for visiting India is to go and see slums and see how people live in slums. And somehow they find it very interesting. But the fact is that slums do exist in India today. I remember when I was a kid, I lived as a kid in Europe for a few years. And as a kid, a few years is like a lifetime, right? So when I first returned to India, the plane landed in one of the major cities of India. I will not name it. And on both sides of the highway, you had these slums. The plane is landing. You can see slums on both sides of the highway, huts, terrible conditions, and all these non Indians, they were taking photographs out of the plane's windows. So if we, and the thing is that, see, I'm not naming any place. I'm sure there are many big cities in India where you have slums. And at least in some of these places, these slums are deliberately kept in place as vote banks by the local politicians. I'm not naming any city, please note that. But there are many places where this happens. We have the resources and the wherewithal to eliminate all slums in India today. We can create proper housing and construction and give people affordable housing. So why can't we do it? Some That's why I say that so the states have too much autonomy. Many of the policies that certain states are implementing and following are inimical to the national interest. India today has enough money to eradicate slums and homelessness forever, but we are still not doing it. So this situation will continue as long as the current system continues. There is unfortunately corruption in some places. There are certain politicians who are self-serving in some places. Not, I'm not saying all, some places, right? And certain states, a few, I would imagine, I can, maybe you can think of a couple of examples. There are some states where the policies are not very good. So as long as this system continues, this self-serving system with with which tolerates corrupt politicians, then these problems will continue. And as long as these problems continue, we will have slums and dirty places, and then foreigners who enjoy this sort of thing, they enjoy poverty tourism, slum tourism, they will keep on doing this, and the image of India as a dirty poor country will be perpetuated. See how the Chinese have transformed their reputation and their image in the eyes of the world. They've been able to do it. We can also do it if we want to, but I think it will take time because the system is so deeply entrenched that I think it's going to be at least another 10, 20 years before we start making significant changes. But it will happen. It will. Prashant says recently ISRO has developed bricks to build structures on Mars. Your views. Where does India stand in the space race? ISRO is. I'm not sure if ISRO is developing bricks. I heard some institutes in India, scientific institutes in India, were developing bricks. So I find that about as interesting as a cricket match between Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. No disrespect to either of these countries. That's the most boring thing ever. ISRO's job is not to build bricks. ISRO's job is to build the next generation of space rockets and take India forward into space. Why waste money on building bricks? You can use any brick on the moon, on Mars. That's not a big achievement if you have developed a brick. If that is being done, it's unfortunate, it's terrible, it's very underwhelming. It's not some great achievement that we should be proud of. Developing bricks. Bricks you can develop, man. You don't need a scientific training to develop bricks. So ISRO's job is to develop the next generation of cutting edge space technologies and rockets and space stations, and take India to the moon, to Mars, and further in the solar system, and establish India as a major top three space power. That's what ISRO's job is. I am not criticizing the scientists. The scientists don't make decisions, they do as they are told. It is the government and the administrators of ISRO who actually tell the scientists what to do. The scientists have no real autonomy. They simply follow orders. So if they are told to deploy to develop bricks, they will develop bricks. That's how it is. Where does India stand in the space race? India has fallen behind in the space race. A decade ago, India was at the forefront of the space race. We had sent a space probe to Mars on the first attempt. Not even the US was able to do that. The only nation to successfully send a spacecraft to Mars in the first attempt, and that too on a shoestring budget. That demonstrated the incredible scientific ability of India's scientists and of ISRO. So that tells you what ISRO is capable of. That tells you the kind of scientific talent that India has. But in the past few years, nothing has happened. So we had this one Chandrayaan attempt in 2019. They should have sent a second Chandrayaan spacecraft 6 months later, and we are still waiting for Chandrayaan 3. When will it happen? Right? The Chandrayaan orbiter succeeded, but the lander failed for certain reasons. I do not blame India's scientists for the failure of the lander. The lander was perfect. Something else went wrong. Anyhow, that's a different story. So, so India is not at the forefront of the space race anymore. The Chinese and the Americans are at the forefront. Uh, the last year, I think in the past 2 years since the pandemic began, we hardly had 5 or 6 space launches from India. The Chinese must have done over 100. The Americans have done well in excess of 100 in these past 2 years. SpaceX itself has launched 60, 70, 80, I'm not sure, I don't know, maybe more than 100 rockets. So the pandemic did not stop or slow down the Americans or the Chinese, but India, everything came to a halt. So India is kind of falling behind right now, which is extremely disappointing. Extremely disappointing. We have the potential, the talent, the ability to become the number one space power. And if you are at the forefront of space, you're going to be at the forefront of a whole wide variety of technologies, which will make you a global superpower. In the 21st century, the two or three nations that are at the forefront of space exploration are going to be the two or three nations that rule the world. So India needs to take this very seriously. Once people start colonizing the moon and Mars, there will not be enough space left there for other countries. The Chinese are making a beeline to the moon. So are the Americans. In the next 2 to 3 years, by 2025 or 26, the Americans plan to land human beings on the moon again, probably by 24, I think. So they will obviously want to establish a permanent settlement on the moon. The Chinese also want to do that. India should not get left behind. It's like the exploration of the oceans all over again. There is this quest for new territories to conquer. The next frontier is space. It's the moon, it's Mars. India has to ensure it is not left behind. We have not even launched a human being into space yet. So we need to get going with that. Right now, it is very disappointing, but we have the potential to become a space superpower in a matter of a couple of decades. So I hope there are plans to follow up on that. Anvesh says, can we make it to Mars? As far as Elon Musk's dream is concerned, what technological progress needs to be done to establish a human settlement on Mars? As of today, 2022, we have the technology to send a human being to Mars and bring him or her back safely. But the technology has not been made foolproof and failure proof completely. So there is a significant probability of failure. And it's okay if your rocket explodes or if your spacecraft is lost, but it's a whole different thing if there's a person on it. A human life, especially in space, has a whole different value. So the only thing that is stopping people right now is that there is a significant chance of something going wrong, and you just don't want the bad optics of losing a human life, right? So we already have the technology. Even ISRO can spend a spacecraft to Mars using its feeble underpowered rockets, PSLV, which is the tiny rocket compared to what SpaceX has or China has. So even ISRO can send a spacecraft to Mars, and ISRO already has the technology of a space capsule that can support human life. It's not been tested thoroughly yet, but we already have the technology. We've already built one, and we even tested some of it, some of the components. So the Chinese have been sending human beings into Earth's orbit. They have a small space station. The Russians have the technology. The Americans have the technology. So it can already be. We already have the components and the technology to send human beings to Mars and possibly bring them back alive. But it has not yet been made completely foolproof, fail proof. So I expect that the first attempt on Mars may happen by the late 2020s or the mid 2030s at the latest. And most likely, Elon Musk would want to be the person to do that, to launch uh, human beings via SpaceX. So that's what I see happening within a decade, may at max a decade and a half. Okay, Ganpat says, we know that it's almost impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. So are there other ways to travel in the universe? Can scientists develop it in the near future, 100 a century, century and a half, to develop other methods? Okay, first of all, it's not almost impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. It is impossible to travel at the speed of light or faster. Impossible, zero chance. That's just what the laws of physics tell us. So it's not almost impossible, it's 100% impossible. Of course, nowadays there is talk of warp drive technologies. There are certain solutions of Einstein's field equations that allow you to create a bubble of space time that travels within space, travels in some ways faster than the speed of light. That is still all hypothetical. We're not still not sure if it is feasible, but even if that happens, it's a couple of centuries in the future, at least a century in the future. What we can do right now is to try and accelerate spacecraft to significant percentages of the speed of light, maybe 20 or 30% of the speed of light. That can be achieved in the next decade or so. But what kind of spacecraft? Small spacecraft. So there is a project called Breakthrough Starshot, which proposes using radiation pressure, photonic pressure, using lasers, pulsed laser arrays of pulsed lasers, to accelerate small micro spacecraft to 20 or 30% the speed of light, and to send an entire big fleet of 1,000, 2,000 spacecraft, small ones, to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, and to send back images and data from there. So that technology could be achievable in the next 10 or 20 years. That could happen. From the perspective of physics, it's completely feasible. It's completely possible. It's only a question of developing the technology, the lasers that can do that. And those spacecraft will have to be tiny, small spacecraft, just essentially little chips with some optical elements to take images, and some transmitters to send the data back to Earth. So that kind of thing could happen in the next 10, 20 years. And if we can accelerate those spacecraft to about 30% of the speed of light, they could reach Proxima Centauri in 2, 3, or 4 decades. And then you would need another 4 years for the signals to come back to Earth. So within half a century, we could have the first close up images of a different star system. So that is very much possible. But warp technology is still very much science fiction. That I don't see that happening for the next century or so. Okay, Birupaksh says, in theoretical physics, will we ever get a final answer? Every time there has been some research done, instead of answers, we only come up with more and more questions. This is a matter of concern, but at the same time, it's a perfect example of how beautiful our universe and physics is. It's endless. So, will we ever get a final answer? No. I know we won't get a final answer. So, right now, excuse me, right now we understand less than 5% of the universe. More than 95% of the universe is dark. We don't know what it is. We don't know what the laws of physics are that govern it. There may be new physics, there may be new forces out there. There is something called dark matter, there is something called dark energy, which collectively makes up more than 95% of the mass energy composition of the universe. And we don't know anything about it. So we understand less than 5% of the universe. And even that understanding is rough and rudimentary. Even the standard model is not perfect. There could be cracks appearing in the standard model of physics as well. So that's where we are. So why do I say we will never get the final answer? Because we are not gods. We have a small, limited intellect. There are limits to human intelligence. Let's not start believing we will understand everything. We are just a species of monkey. We are the highest evolved ape on the planet. That's all we are. Yesterday we were climbing trees and eating bananas. Now we are doing quantum mechanics. It's just a small step. There are lots of other steps we need to take to actually start understanding the universe properly. And maybe the limitations of our small, tiny intellect are such that we may never understand the universe unless we evolve to something much higher in a few million years, perhaps. So, and yet it is not bad. It's not a question of concern for me. I mean, if we get all the final answers, then after that, what are we going to do? There will be nothing left to find. There will be nothing left to discover if we have the final answer. As long as there are things that we have not discovered, there is a mystery in the universe. And what's more interesting and exciting than mystery? Why do we watch movies? Because there is a mystery we want to solve. Why do we read novels? Because there are mysteries in there. We want to uncover the mystery. We want to get the final answer. It's the journey that's interesting. The final answer is okay, the journey is over. Right. So 95% plus of the universe is unknown to us, which I think is fantastic. It's so exciting. There is so much we can discover. So I think it's great, and I don't think we will ever get the final answer, which is fine by me. Which is fine. Alpha Beta says, like the sun has an important role in life, making planets and so on. What role does a black hole have in the universe? Black holes are a big mystery. They have a very significant role to play. Black holes seem to have been the seeds of the early galaxies. Every major galaxy, most galaxies that we know of, have a supermassive black hole at the center, which holds the galaxy together. So it is that central supermassive black hole that essentially holds the entire structure together with its massive gravity. Recently, the Event Horizon Telescope was able to take this a snapshot of the supermassive black hole at the center of our own galaxy. So that happened just this week, I think, or last week. So it's the second black hole ever imaged. Obviously, it's the image of the accretion disk around the black hole, not the black hole itself, which is dark. But that's how it is. So black holes have one role: they hold galaxies together, and we can feel the gravitational effects of the black hole. We just don't realize it. Every gravitating object in the universe exerts a gravitational force on us. We feel the effects, whether we realize it or not. We feel it. So the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy, I can right now experience its effects, but I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. That's how it is. So that is one thing: they hold galaxies together. Secondly, uh, they may be a significant percentage of the dark matter of the universe. In the very early phase of the universe, during the before inflation and even after inflation, during the reheating epoch, it is believed that because of quantum fluctuations, enormous quantities of microscopic black holes may have been produced. These are called primordial black holes. And if these black holes possibly formed bound states, stable bound states, and survived, then they would possibly form a significant percentage of the dark matter in the universe today. That's my theory. It's published. I'm a co-author of that. So black holes could play lots of roles. We still don't know what black holes are really, right? Many of the objects we think are black holes may end up being something else. Who knows? So, but it's clear that black holes play a significant role in the universe. They provide the gravitational framework for the galaxies, and they may have a significant role to play in dark matter itself. We know dark matter exists everywhere. Right now, in this room where I'm sitting, there is a wind of dark matter flowing through me, but we don't feel its effects because it is a purely gravitating particle or class of particles, and it's very small apparently. So there's dark matter going through me right now, through me, through me, inside me, and I don't feel it. So that also could be, in some ways, related to microscopic black holes, perhaps. But it all is still a matter of just theory. We still lack the means to actually experimentally test all of these things. So maybe in the future, maybe hopefully in our lifetimes. Chiching says, how not to overthink when one is not busy or not working. See, the mind is a thinking machine. In Indian philosophy, the mind is considered to be one of the sense organs, right? And the mind, it always thinks. Whether you are busy, whether you're working, whether you're actively studying something, actively participating in some activity, or whether you're sitting idle, the mind is always at work. It's always thinking. And even when we are sleeping, the mind is thinking, and we call it dreams. So we experience dreams. Most of these dreams we forget. Some of them we may remember, but everybody dreams, and that is the subconscious mind at work. We don't quite know what is the purpose of dreaming. I think the question is different, obviously, how not to overthink. So overthinking is just the mind constantly going in all different directions, all kinds of thoughts coming to your mind, worries and random noise in the mind. The mind is full of noise. So how not to overthink takes practice. And the best way of doing it is through meditation. And the starting point of meditation is breath control, controlling your breath. And the easiest way of learning breath control is via pranayam. So in pranayam, you control your breath, then you focus in your breath and you control it in a variety of ways. And if you can learn that, then you will be able to uh, start meditating effectively. Even that takes time. But meditation is all about calming the mind, stilling it, quieting it. And when anyone starts or tries meditating for the first time, it is extremely frustrating because the mind rebels against your attempt to calm it and to quiet it. The more you try, the more noisy it gets and the more rebellious the mind gets. But you have to persevere at it. It takes weeks, months sometimes, but eventually there's a breakthrough and you get better at that. And over time you get really good at it, and then that's when you're calm and focused. So it's a process. I think this is something that happens to everybody. Everybody's mind is always constantly gibbering, jabbering away. It's a noisy machine. So yeah, I think the best way is to meditate, and meditate regularly. You can start with 10 minutes a day, and even before you start meditating, you can start with breath control, which is pranayam. So it's something you have to develop. It's a skill. It's essentially a skill that you develop over a long period of time. And if you are a teenager or something, it's great, you have plenty of time to do that. So by the time you're 18 or 20, you will be well versed in that. So don't get frustrated if it doesn't work at first. Persevere, take it one day at a time, start with 10 minutes at a time, and eventually you will get good at it, and you will be able to calm the mind down. And that has immense benefits in all aspects of life. So great question, and all the best. Okay, the next question is by Akash. And Akash asks, this might be too specific, but I am asking anyway because you have experience in this too. Software engineering versus data science. Which of these are more impactful and more in demand in the modern evolving world? That's a good question. So these are two things, two separate things, but there is a lot of overlap also between software development and data science. So data scientists, they essentially what they do is they research and develop algorithms, machine learning algorithms. That's what data scientists do. Software engineers that develop software, they focus on the software development life cycle, right? They do things like creating infrastructure, automation, testing, maintenance of software, designing software products and apps and all that. Engineers focus on programming, object oriented programming and all that. Data science has a focus on statistics. It has a focus on data analytics, on predictive analytics, on data sets. You are working with data sets, you're doing data manipulation, you're creating models and things like that. So that is all about data science. Both are impactful, both are in demand. I think if you look up the statistics, I think data scientists today earn slightly more than software engineers as of today. I'm talking about US data, US statistics, but it would apply to other countries as well, I'm sure. So I think data scientists, they earn slightly more, and data science is increasingly more in demand because data is the new oil, isn't it? There is so much data being generated every second today in the world. Data, metadata, all that. And that is where the real sociology comes in, because if you have this entire data set of every person, you can actually crunch through it using algorithms, and you can actually uncover the entire psyche of the person, the psychology of the person, the behavioral patterns, thought patterns, everything, if you have the right data. And that is extraordinarily powerful in the hands of the right people, or extraordinarily dangerous as well. So I think that there's a great future for data science and data analytics. It can be really impactful, and it is certainly going to be more and more in demand in the modern evolving world. Software engineering is also never going to go out of existence, because software engineering is all about creating solutions and maintaining solutions and evolving solutions to various problems. So there is a lot of overlap where these two fields merge, come together. Data scientists would obviously need to know some programming and all that. Software engineers obviously have to work with data when they're developing apps or all that. So there's a lot of overlap. So you could either go into pure data science, or you could go into a bit of both. But I think in the long run, data science has a lot of demand and a lot of scope for growth and progress as a career option. Okay, Vikrant says Ambassador Kajju once said that Pakistan will always be allowed to stay afloat, irrespective of any crisis, economic or otherwise, because no country wants a nuclear Somalia. What are your thoughts? So I am not aware of this quote. Maybe he said that, possible. But it's an interesting quote, it's an interesting idea, it's an interesting thought. So Pakistan will always be allowed to stay afloat because nobody wants a nuclear Somalia. Well, I think this is the perspective of the West. Pakistan is far away from the West, but they don't want a nuclear state, which is a rogue state with no governance, which is essentially what Somalia is. But from the perspective of India, a nuclear Pakistan or a nuclear Somalia is the same thing. It is nuclear weapons in the hands of the wrong people. So from India's perspective, I'm sure the US, see, the real thing is this: the reason why Pakistan was created and the reason why Pakistan still exists, it has still been allowed to, it is still allowed to exist, is to keep on, it's to keep India on the back foot. It's to counterbalance India. It's to keep bleeding India. The Americans financed Pakistani terrorism in India from the 1980s onwards for the best part of 2.5 decades. So they used Pakistan as a means of destabilizing and bleeding India. Right. That is the real purpose of Pakistan. It's not about not wanting a nuclear Somalia. And the West doesn't want India to rise beyond a certain point. And India is currently on a trajectory of rising much higher than they want India to rise. So Pakistan becomes indispensable in that position, in that scenario. So they would not want Pakistan to to be destroyed, to disintegrate. They would want Pakistan to always remain there to counterbalance India. Right. So that is the real reason why Pakistan exists and the reason why it has been allowed to stay afloat. Not because they are concerned about a nuclear Somalia and rogue nuclear weapons. They are concerned about India's rise. That's the real problem. From India's perspective, Pakistan is a problem. As long as Pakistan exists on the western border, we will always have problems. And even if hypothetically some government had given Kashmir away, the problem would have not gone away. It's not the problem, the issue is not Kashmir. Pakistan seeks India as an existential threat. That's what they claim. But the real thing is that it's a tool in the hands of the West to keep on destabilizing India. If Western interference was not there, tomorrow India could buy out Pakistan's nuclear weapons and buy out the Pakistani generals. They have a price, they are mercenaries. You give them enough money, you meet their price, and they will hand over their country to you. And they will go and live in the West. That's what they will do. So the real reason why Pakistan exists is because it is a valuable counterbalance to India in the eyes and in the hands of the West. It's a Western tool, and recently it's become a Chinese tool as well, and they see it in the same light. So that is the utility that Pakistan has for the West and for China, and that's why it has been allowed to keep on existing. So it is for India to solve the problem. Nobody is going to solve India's problems except India itself. So it is the current leadership and future leaders who will have to tackle this problem and to solve the problem once and for all. It can be solved. Time will show us. Okay, let's take a few live chat questions, shall we? Let's take a few live chat questions. If you all have questions, let me know now. Let's go. Okay. Do we have questions? Do we have questions? Shweta says, what is this helium-3 found on the moon all about? So helium-3 is an isotope. It's an isotope of helium. Helium is helium-2. The helium atom has two protons and two electrons going around that. That's how it is. It stays neutral. Helium-3 has two protons in the nucleus and an extra neutron. So its atomic number is 3, and that is helium-3. It's a heavier isotope of the element helium, and it is found in abundance on the moon, on in the regolith, which is the lunar soil, the topsoil of the moon, because of the constant bombardment of the solar radiation and cosmic rays. That's what has created this abundance of helium 3 atoms on the surface of the moon. And helium 3 is believed is an excellent nuclear fuel for next generation fusion reactors. As of today, we have not been able um, to create controlled fusion on the earth. We have been able to create fusion reactions which have been uncontrolled, and that's what a thermonuclear explosion is. It's a fission fusion reaction. But if you can control fusion, then that will give you an even better source of energy than a nuclear reactor, which is all about fission, the fission reaction. So so right now there are projects going on which whose aim is to create a fusion reactor, a sustainable controlled fusion reaction on earth, which has still not succeeded, but maybe it will happen in the next 10, 20 years. So when fusion reactors become a reality, that's when helium 3 comes in. It's going to be an excellent fuel for these reactors, and it is very rare on earth, but it's found in great abundance in the lunar soil. So that is what this is all about. I think Dr. APG Abdul Kalam had spoken about this, that the lunar helium 3 is going to be an excellent fuel for future fusion reactors. So that's what it is all about. Okay, how to understand physics? Start from the very basics. Start from understanding mathematics. Then start with the ABCs of physics, like school level. And once you are good with that, go to the higher level, higher level, higher level. And in a few years, you'll be able to understand physics well, depending on your progress and your speed of and the speed at which you absorb new information and the amount of hard work that you put in. It's a process. Okay. What's your thought on Western channels bashing India? Are they doing so because we abstained? They are doing it because they don't want India to rise, and they are worried about India's rise on the global scenario. They see the Western channels belong to the Western countries, Western Europe and the US, and this entire region, the so-called Western civilization, it's actually the US empire, right? And the US doesn't want India to rise beyond a certain limit, because then India will become the next China if it is allowed to keep on rising. So that's why they have embarked upon this entire phase, this entire campaign, concerted, protracted campaign of demonizing and bashing India and lecturing India and bullying India and telling India to get in line. So it's all over the Western media, it's all over Twitter, it's all over social media, all these think tanks like Rand Corporation and whatever else, and even lots of Indian puppets in the Indian media. They are all doing the same thing. So it's not about India abstaining, it's about India pursuing an independent foreign policy. They don't want India to pursue an independent foreign policy. They want India to toe their line and do what they tell India to do, which essentially makes India an American vassal state, which is not going to happen. So India is not towing their line. India is pursuing an independent foreign policy. India is pursuing a strategy of multi alignment, multilateralism. India wants a multipolar world. As long as India pursues this foreign policy, a multilateral world is going to be there. And they don't want a multilateral world. They want a bilateral world, good and bad. They will say we are good, China is bad. They only want two powers. As long as India is independent like this, there are more than two powers. So that's the whole thing. That's the whole game that is being played, and that's why they are bashing India. And that actually is a great compliment to our foreign policy, that they are so upset about it, because we are looking out for our own national interest. Okay, what else do we have? Neil says how to read books correctly, how to remember for a long time, how to use in real life. Many people say that they have a problem. They don't remember things that they read in the books and all. So the thing is very simple. If you don't find it interesting, you will not remember it. It's like this: go and watch a movie which is very boring. Chances are, after a week's time, you will remember nothing of it. I recently watched this movie, Multiverse of Madness, last week. I remember next to nothing about it. It was so boring. There was no storyline. So if you watch a movie that you find boring, in your opinion, then you will remember nothing, or almost nothing. And similarly, if you read a book, if you force yourself to read a book that you find boring, you won't remember anything. But if you watch a really exciting, interesting movie, after 3 years, you will remember the entire storyline. Similarly, if you read a book that's really interesting, you will remember it for a long time. So, how to read books correctly? Before you even open a book, look at the title. What does the title say? The title gives you a promise. The title tells you that this is what's inside the book. So before you open the book and start reading, make a list of 5 questions or 10 questions that you would like to have the book answer for you. And then look through the book and find the relevant portion where your question is answered. So if you have 5 questions that you hope the book will answer, if it can answer all 5, great, read the whole book. And you may find it very interesting. But if you find that the book doesn't answer the questions that you have, or if it doesn't answer them satisfactorily, then maybe it's not the right book for you. So it's not about it being a good book or a bad book. It may not be the right book for you. So the best way to approach reading a book is to first have a set of questions, or have a set of topics about which you want information, about which you seek information. And when you find the information, you will not forget it because you were looking for it. And that's not the only way to read a book. Obviously, some books will have information that you may find interesting, even if you don't, even if you have not thought about it. But to start off in your journey of reading books and retain information, start with a list of questions before you even open a book. That way, you will be able to remember for a long time if the book can answer your questions. And how to use it in real life? Well, if you read a book of philosophy, you may not be able to use it in real life. If you read a book about tomato gardening, you will not be able to use it in economics. Or so so if you read a book that has applications in real life, and if you're able to remember it, you'll be able to use it in real life. That's how it will go, sir. Okay. The bricks were made by space enthusiasts who made bricks from mixture similar to soil on the moon. This was kept in mind to make a base, etc. All right, sir. Great. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, what else? What else? Can we find new elements in asteroid mining like vibranium? Vibranium, I think, is some fictional element, right? So we cannot find science fiction elements anywhere in the universe. We can only find the elements that are in the periodic table, even elements that have not been discovered yet, but the periodic table can predict elements that will be discovered in the future. So only those elements can be found anywhere in the universe. Now, when it comes to asteroid mining, that's not going to happen anytime soon. It's not like we have asteroids everywhere. It will take a great amount of resources to reach an asteroid, because the asteroids are typically in the region between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, right? That's very far away from here. So just to reach an asteroid, and that entire region of space is mostly empty space. The average distance between any two asteroids is several millions of kilometers. It's almost empty space. So asteroid mining is could be a pipe dream. It could be really prohibitively expensive. But if you can find a big asteroid and you can actually mine it, you may be able to find great amounts of metals and useful things, which may kind of crash Earth's economy if you can bring it back to Earth. So that's what it is about. Okay, do we see something else? Do we have any other interesting questions? Let me take one more question before I am done. Okay, this is a question I must have answered 300 times, but let's take it. If Aryan invasion theory is a myth, why is Bharat called Aryavat? What is the origin of the word Aryan? The word Arya is a Sanskrit word which means civilized, noble, well behaved. That's what it means. It is not an ethnic term. It means noble and civilized and cultured. That's what Arya means. It is not an ethnic connotation. The Persians, who left India several thousand years ago, they started using the word Arya as an ethnic term, as an ethnic self designator. And that's how this word came into, eventually made its way to Europe. And they started calling the Indians and Iranians Aryans. And then the white supremacists stole it. And they started using it to denote the white race. So Aryavrat means the land of the civilized and noble people. It means all Indians are Arya. That's what it means. So that is the origin of the word Arya. Let me take one more question. Let me take one more question. Something interesting. Why do we dream? Do we dream of immense events occurring in alternate realities? We don't know why we dream. That's a mystery nobody has been able to answer, neither neurologists or psychiatrists or psychologists or anybody. We still don't quite know why we dream. We don't know the mechanism of dreaming. We don't know the mechanism of consciousness, whether it is something that emerges out of the brain, it comes from somewhere else. We don't know. We don't quite know. Some people would say that dreams are what you experience in a parallel universe. There is a multiverse out there, and there is a you in each universe. And when you sleep, you connect with the you in that other universe, in one of the other universes, and you experience the reality they are living. That's what some people say. That is science fiction, obviously, or fantasy. So that's all speculation. We don't quite know why we dream. Nobody has been able to solve the mystery of dreaming, of sleeping. Why do we sleep? Why do we need sleep? You keep any animal or human being alive for a certain period of time, they're going to fall into a coma. They may even die. So sleep is necessary. We spend at least a third of our lives sleeping and dreaming. So what are dreams? What is it? Is it the brain reconfiguring data and information? Is it something else entirely happening? We don't know. That is an answer nobody has. So who am I to answer it? I don't have the answer. But it's an interesting question. Sometimes the questions are more interesting than the answers. All right, people. Thank you so much for another wonderful session, wonderful questions. And let's do it again soon. Maybe not next week. Next week I'll be traveling, so we may not have a live stream. But after that, we will resume this. So thank you so much. And I'll see you soon. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.